after 21 years of working with people and helping them strengthen their relationship with themselves, and 11 years very specifically working with people and their romantic lives, I realized two really important things. There's like two of the most incredible discoveries that I made about relationships. One is that our greatest fear is that somehow we are not lovable. And of course, self-esteem exists on a spectrum. There are people who have, what would be considered healthy self-esteem. And then there would be people who are considered to have low self-esteem, in which case that's a problem, because if you have low self-esteem, then when it comes to a relationship, then you're more likely to not speak your truth. You're more likely to people please. You're more likely to tolerate abuse. You're more likely to anxiously cling or anxiously avoid. But regardless of where your confidence is or your self-esteem is or isn't, there is nothing like a romantic relationship that is going to trigger us, because it's where we feel most vulnerable. Because we know that as much as we would like for it to be different, we know that even if we have the most secure relationship, that someone is not obligated to keep loving us. Like, we can't actually force someone to keep loving us. And we can't force someone to stay in a relationship with us. And, we change and life happens. And, even like I said, I always say this, even the most certain relationships, the most secure relationships where you are really, really certain and secure of each other's love and commitment to each other, there is still a level of uncertainty that is built into the very fabric of a relationship. It's we change, they change, life happens. And how we cope with that inherent uncertainty that exists in life and therefore in relationships really determines the quality of our relationships. Because we are most vulnerable in a romantic relationship, this is the person we get naked with physically and emotionally. This is the person who we open our hearts to and give them essentially the power, if they were to yield that power, to destroy our hearts. And what I discovered is that because everyone on some level has a fear that they are not enough, and that because they're not enough, they might lose love. Like, we might lose love. And if we lose love, then we believe that we are unlovable. That fear is the thing that leads us to do all these crazy things in a relationship. It is the root of all evil, if you will, in a relationship. And so in trying to have healthier relationships, in trying to transform our love lives, we first have to look at ourselves and say, how healthy or unhealthy am I being in a relationship? Where am I? How much dysfunction is there? And what I mean by dysfunction is, what am I doing that's interfering with the functionality of a relationship? What am I doing to decrease the level of function, of high functionality in a relationship? And then we think, oh God, I keep doing this thing. I keep clinging, or I keep pulling away, or I keep sabotaging. Like, we all have these habits, and it all boils down to this fear that we're not going to be enough, and we're going to be unlovable. And what I realize is that everyone has this fear, and that it's this fear that underscores all of our behavior, regardless of attachment style. And then the second thing is that this fear of not being enough is heavily conditioned. It's conditioned by our family. It's conditioned by our peers when we went to school. It's conditioned by experiences that we have. or didn't have. Just like feeling confident or feeling good enough is also conditioned by things that happen in childhood. They're conditioned by certain things that happen along the way of our lives, with our friends, with our family, with our achievements in school or sports or hobbies or career. The reason why we do certain things in relationships that we don't want to do, the reason why we maybe tolerate too much, the reason why we do things from an insecure place, from a fearful place, is because we are afraid in some way that we're not going to be enough for the person that we care about, that they're going to discover something in us and be like, I'm not interested in that. That somehow we're going to be vulnerable. And then once we're vulnerable, they're going to see that they don't want to be with us. And some people, it's like they have to be perfect. And some people, it's like they have to look a certain way, or they have to have certain money in the bank, or they have to be cool, right? And so we do all these things to strategize to either get someone to be interested in us, or we strategize for someone to stay loving us. And then we realize, like, why are my relationships not going well? Like, what's going on in my marriage, or what's going on in my love life? What's going on in dating? And when you can realize that it all comes down to this fear that somehow you are not lovable, but it's all a lie. And it's a lie that we tell ourselves that likely came from childhood. When I made this discovery that all the things that we do that we just don't want to do, like these patterns that we don't want to have anymore in relationship, these cycles that we just want to break, this attachment styles that we want to heal, when it all boils down to this fear, this innate fear that we have inside of us that we're unlovable, that if love is taken away from us, it just reaffirms our greatest fear that maybe we weren't deserving of love to begin with. And it can be very insidious. And I realize how we view ourselves and how we've been conditioned to even view ourselves from childhood impacts our relationships. People ruin their relationships because they don't feel good enough. They get into situationships or complicated, anxiety-producing relationships because they do not feel worthy as they are. They get into relationships with people who don't treat them well because they don't feel good enough. And they will, again, ruin a really good relationship because they are so afraid that they are not going to be good enough for the other person. And this starts in childhood, but can also happen because of a past relationship. It can happen because of something that happened in school. But we all have a belief that somewhere inside of us, we are not as valuable as we need to be. And that's not the same for everyone. But when I discovered that pretty much all relationship problems, other than the lack of communication, boils down to people pretending to be someone who they're not because they actually don't feel good enough as they are, or people avoiding or shutting down or withdrawing or clinging and anxiously hanging on because they do not think that they are good enough as they are. When I realized that, I realized how to heal relationships. So I'm going to read a section from It Begins With You that will illustrate this point. When I was 11 years old, my father, a psychiatrist, published a book called The Difficult Child. It was quickly touted as one of the most influential books on child psychology of its time. It was placed in bookstores next to books by child psychology legends like Dr. Spock. What was the book about? Me. As a baby, I cried all the time and wouldn't adhere to its steady circadian rhythm. As a toddler, I needed a ton of structure, hated the way certain fabrics felt on my skin. I also had tantrums all the time. My sisters, in contrast, were more normal. One was much older, and the other sister, also older than me, had a much quieter nature. My father, being a child psychiatrist, wanted to understand why I behaved this way, why I was the child at the park who, with no apparent trigger, would go ballistic, screaming, crying, and sending my mom into a panic as she tried to console me. So he put me under a microscope and studied me and diagnosed me as the difficult child. My father wrote that difficult children are born that way, thereby reassuring parents that they were not failures. He then added that by the time I was 11, I actually got over being difficult and was a well-adjusted normal kid, which gave the readers something to look forward to with their own difficult children. But even though I outgrew being difficult, the identity was a tough one to shake. I was referred to that way my whole childhood, and even into my young adulthood, I would meet parents who, after learning my name, would flip out with a gleeful, "Oh my God, I read your dad's book." I wasn't Jillian. I was difficult. So I cannot stress to you enough how you feel about yourself and the beliefs that you have about who you are what determine the path of your relationships and the quality of your relationships. Maybe for you it was difficult. Maybe it was for you lazy. Maybe it was for you like you had to be like the all-star in sports. So in relationships, if you were never perfect or if you were never succeeding at a high level, or, like for me, being difficult means can't have any needs. You don't want to seem to be difficult. And that's also societal pressure that's put on women, that we're not supposed to have needs. We're supposed to have it all together. So these beliefs that we have about ourselves that are shaped from a very young age shape our relationships. And so if we want to actually heal our relationships, if we want our relationship to be better, if we want to break painful cycles where we just never are in a healthy relationship, or our relationships just end, or whatever it is, whatever cycle you find yourself in, it all begins with understanding the ways in which you don't feel like you are good enough. Because when we don't feel good enough, we will strategize, we will manipulate, we will cling, we will yell, we will scream, we will avoid, we will shut down. Oftentimes we have a hard time regulating our emotions because what's driving those emotions is an extreme fear that someone is going to see the real us, or see the parts of us that we so want to hide because they're maybe the less savory parts of ourselves. We're so afraid that someone is going to see those parts of ourselves that when they do, they're going to leave us. And so we all come up with strategies, survival mechanisms, to make it so that we are not going to be overwhelmed or left abandoned. And you can see this a lot in the dance between anxious attachment and avoidance attachment. And let's just shelve that for just 1 second, just for a moment. We all go into a relationship, and some of us are more wired for connection and togetherness, while others are more wired for autonomy and freedom. And a relationship is a dance where we are constantly straddling the line between togetherness and freedom. It is a dance where we are constantly trying to negotiate, sometimes verbally, oftentimes non-verbally, with our partner, with our loved one, how much dependence there's going to be and how much independence there's going to be. This term interdependence, which kind of blends the two, like I'm not dependent, I'm interdependent. Really all that means is that when we create interdependence in a relationship, it just means that we have found a balance between dependence and independence, but it's not fixed. You might go through a period of time in your relationship where you are more dependent on the other, you're more dependent on each other. There's going to be very difficult things that you and a partner are going to face in life if it's going to last long term. And there are going to be times where you're going to have to rely more heavily on each other. And then there's going to be times where maybe you're working on a project or there's literal more time apart where there's going to be more about your independence. The health of a relationship is really so heavily determined by how well two people can navigate and agree on and align on the dependence and the independence. But when two people find each other and one person is more wired for togetherness and the other person is more wired for independence, and then what you throw into that mix is a fear of intimacy. A fear of intimacy, which really just comes down to a fear of being vulnerable, which then even comes further down to a fear that you are not enough, that you're going to be left, that you're going to be unlovable. And remember, that is the ultimate fear. You throw into the mix that, and then what you start to see is a person's attachment wounds. It's like, okay, I'm more wired for connection and togetherness, but I've also been abandoned in the past. I also have felt like I'm not good enough. And so I'm going to get into a relationship and I might cling more and have and present signs and symptoms of anxious attachment. And then you might get into a relationship with someone who's more wired for independence. But then they are also very afraid that they're going to be seen for who they really are and they're going to be abandoned. They're going to be afraid that they're going to be needed so much that they're not going to be able to have their independence. So they have their fear of intimacy and their fear of vulnerability and their fear of closeness. So you got one person fearing separateness, and you have one person who's fearing closeness. And yet both people, what they really crave is to be loved. And what they really crave is to be accepted, even though they have this thing about them that they don't really love about themselves. And so they start to do these crazy things in the relationship. One person is trying to pull away because they think the other person is needy. The other person is trying to get closer to them. And this is when that sort of dance of trying to find interdependence becomes almost impossible. Because you have two people terrified that they're not enough, and one person values closeness and the other person values independence. They don't know how to communicate with each other, and they find each other to be a threat, and yet they're attracted to each other and want to be with each other. That's a major, major, major conundrum. And so if you grew up with something like I did, like I'm difficult, or, I had an abandoning father, you might find that you're anxious in some relationships, or you might find that you're not expressing what your needs are because you don't want to be seen as difficult. Or maybe you were the caretaker in your family and you took care of everyone. Everyone relied on you and you had to grow up really quickly. And so maybe that's something that you bring to your relationships, or maybe that's something that you're running away from your relationships. The point being is you need to understand your psychology, and you need to understand how your past experiences shape you, shape your beliefs, and how those beliefs are shaping your current relationships, or how they have shaped the relationships of your past that have not worked out. And when we start to understand this, then we can start to heal. Then we can start to challenge these beliefs. It might mean, okay, you value closeness. Best to find a partner who values closeness too. And here's the thing. You could be with someone who really, really loves their freedom and independence, but also loves being in a relationship and knows how to kind of balance the two and can communicate about it. And you can be someone who loves your independence, but loves being in a relationship even more. These are not bad things. These are not things to pathologize. What we want to step out of is the dysfunction of the fear controlling the narrative. So you have to understand what your pattern is and how your past, specifically your childhood, shaped that pattern. And then you have to look at it from a different perspective. You know, the fact that my father wrote a book called The Difficult Child because, the truth was I was a very sensitive child. And I grew up in a household between two parents who were very depressed and couldn't stand each other. My sister was far less sensitive, a far more robust nervous system, and she was older. So she came out of the childhood with different strengths and different weaknesses. So the fact that my father wrote that book doesn't actually mean that I'm difficult. It means that I was just a very sensitive child that was reacting to her environment. And I still have sensitivities that I have to work on, or that I have to manage or be mindful of so that I don't get dysregulated. But that is who I am. And it has nothing to do with the needs that I have in a relationship. But for years, when I would think that if I had needs, I was difficult. And that what it meant was, if I'm difficult, if I'm not even Jillian and I'm difficult, then God forbid I actually have needs, because that's only going to prove the fact that I am difficult. So all these little funny things would happen along the way where I wouldn't have needs, right? Or of course I had needs, but I wouldn't communicate my needs. And then I would get resentful, or I would pretend like everything was cool, or I would hyper focus on the needs of my partner without focusing on mine. This was not every relationship. But these were the relationships that proved to be very difficult. These were some of the patterns that I had. And so in order to heal, I had to understand that. And what I'm suggesting to you is that there is a part of you, even if you're a very confident person, that fears that you are not enough in some way. And you need to figure out what that is, where it came from. And part of it is not going to even be childhood. Part of it is going to be society. So part of it's going to be culture. And then you have to see, maybe write it down, how that has impacted, how that fear of not being enough, or how that fear of intimacy, or how that fear of closeness, or how that fear of separation has determined or has influenced and impacted your relationships up until now. And then you can start to challenge the belief. And it just starts by looking at everything differently. You know, when as children, we these beliefs form, and they dictate our lives in many ways. And sometimes it's not necessarily a bad thing. But part of healing and part of maturing is looking back at our past and looking at the story and the belief differently. Looking at the ways in which we don't feel good enough and recognizing that we all have ways in which we don't feel good enough. And then taking the steps to kind of build our self-worth. Taking the steps that are like outlined in this book about how to actually communicate your needs. Taking the steps to heal whatever avoidance you might have. Take the steps to heal whatever anxiety you might have in relationships. And so much of it is just understanding that when you are in reaction in a relationship, you are in reaction because there's something that's been triggered. And what has been triggered inside of you? That you are not enough. And that because of that, something is going to change in your relationship that is not going to serve you. And so to be triggered is to be triggered into protective mode, into survival mode, where you're trying to regain a sense of certainty again, when you're trying to regain a sense of significance again in your relationship. So some people will pull away to feel safer. Some people will cling or some people will get angry. But when you feel triggered, what is being triggered is the fear that you are actually going to lose your oxygen, which is love. And when you're triggered, you go into survival mode. And our main objective in survival mode is to get control again, is to regain control. That control translates as safety. So when you are in a relationship and you are starting to feel your body get flooded with fear, anger, frustration, fight or flight, where you want to flee or you want to get angry, maybe you start to cry, you can start to recognize that what you are experiencing is fear. What you are experiencing is not being seen or understood, aka not being good enough. What you are fearing and what you're experiencing is that somehow the relationship is going to change. You're not going to be good enough. You're not going to you're not going to be lovable. And when we have that awareness, we can take the time to actually self-soothe so that we can come to a more balanced state. Doesn't have to be 100% balanced, but more balanced. And then we don't ruin the relationship. And you can relate this to other areas of your life. You could be seeing this happen at work. You could see this certainly happening with family and with friends. It's not just romantic relationships. All of us have some trauma, and some of us have unspeakable trauma, and some of us have somehow managed to be much luckier. But we all have this sort of conditioning from childhood that says that we have to be a certain way. If you're difficult, then you need to be easy. If you are expected to get, to be the superstar child, then everything is oriented around your achievement. This is not about blaming your parents. This is about understanding the way that you have been formed and how the way you've been formed is impacting your relationship. And it gives you a greater capacity for empathy to understand how your partner, the person that you are in a relationship with, is formed too. This is not an excusal of behavior. It's an understanding of your behavior. Because I always say that even though our childhoods shape who we are, but they don't have to define our futures. We can take from our childhood what really works, and then we can reframe and change the narrative around the ways in which it hasn't. But another thing that I always say, I don't care what has happened in your childhood. I truly believe that everyone with self-awareness and with commitment has the capacity to be in healthy relationships and to be healthier in relationships. So for example, let's just say you're someone who's in a situationship, which is an undefined relationship where you want more and the other person doesn't. Or you get into these, another way to explain it is like you get into these sort of complicated relationships where, there's you don't really know where you stand with someone. Sure, there could be the fear that you don't want to start all over again. There could be the fear that, you're a certain age, right? There's all these beliefs. There's a reason why you're actually in this relationship, even though it is highly unfulfilling to you and it's not reciprocated. But what I want to urge you to do for the sake of today's episode is to peel away the onion to see where the fear of not being good enough is lurking. and how much of that is actually impacting your decision to stay in the relationship. Because I would bet it's impacting it a lot. Might not be the only fear, but it's definitely there. And oftentimes we'll have this fear that, we're not going to be good enough in some way, or we have this fear that someone's going to leave us, or, all of a sudden not find us amazing. And maybe we're overcompensating in some ways. Some of you have a pattern of overgiving while under receiving in a relationship. And that could be because, one, it could be because you're a very giving person, but you're tolerating the under receiving. So maybe there's a people pleaser that lurks inside of you. Because you learned that in order to be good enough, you had to kind of make everyone happy around you, perhaps. Or maybe you learned that what got you love was making sure that you were a good girl or a good boy. And so you don't want to break that identity of being good. And so in relationships, you constantly feel like you're giving while you're not getting enough. And then you grow resentful. And you feel entirely unfulfilled in your relationships. Most all things can be healed by understanding that that you are worthy regardless of what you came with or what you didn't come with. You have things that you need to work on, and you are not perfect, but you have inherent value. And then learning how to communicate with more honesty, with more empathy, and with more compassion. Some of you need to work more on the honesty. Some of you may need to work more on the empathy and compassion. Some of you, it's just a combination of all. There's definitely been times where I have not communicated with empathy and compassion. But I would say that I've had more of a difficult time just expressing what it is that I want or need or feel, even if it meant sort of rocking the boat. Even if it meant, oh, what if I appear like this? Or what if I appear like that? We have so much conditioning other than our childhood sort of just lurking. And it can be very, very intense. But you need to know how it's been panning out for you. You need to understand this is about having insight into yourself. And that's when you can really start to heal. One thing that you could do is just take out a piece of paper and a pen and just write down, who did I have to be in order to get approval? And again, this is your perspective as a child. Everyone has gone through this. This does not mean anything, wrong with your parents necessarily. But who did I have to be? And then write down all the ways in which that's actually helped you in life. And then all the ways that maybe it hasn't helped you in life and how that's actually showing up or has shown up in your romantic relationships. And that's really the first step, is to really understand the impact that it has had. That is the first step of healing is the awareness. Because most of us are walking around completely unconscious of how our behavior impacts others, completely unconscious of our patterns. And healing is really just understanding and seeing that you are worth love regardless of what your attachment style is, regardless of what your history is, regardless of what your past is. And to understand that the decisions that you've made up until now, you've made because they've met some needs. Maybe it's made you feel safe, or maybe it was a need for adventure. You don't do anything unless it meets your needs. So when we talk about emotional intelligence and we talk about having strong character, so much of that is being able to say, yeah, this is my pattern. This is how I've felt I'm not good enough. This is why I've gotten into these certain relationships. And I'm not doing that anymore. I'm going to communicate. I'm going to choose myself. I'm going to be brave. I'm going to realize that that's just my conditioning. It may be a process for me to sort of untangle or rewrite some of the narrative so I can see it differently. But at least now I understand that that's just part of my wiring. And I don't have to do that anymore. And so healing for me, that book my father wrote, I had just to rewrite the whole narrative of how I understood that to be. I mean, I literally wouldn't be here today if that wasn't happening. And I talk about how to heal relationships with parents in my book. It begins with you. So that will be very extremely useful for you. Learning by practicing to just ask for what you need and to ask others what they need is one of the most clear paths towards healthier relationships. Remember, it's not just about what we need, it's what they need too. So having these conversations, because here's the thing, people don't break up when their best interests are being met inside of a relationship. And relationships fall apart because people do not feel like their deepest needs are being met inside of the relationship. Understanding your triggers, understanding what's happening, learning to kind of take a breath, take a walk, bring yourself to a clearer state, like, wow, I am just afraid right now. When you're angry, you're afraid. When you're crying, you're afraid. It really is sort of the root of it all. And that is why we just have to take a lot of deep breaths. We have to do our best to communicate. And when we feel that impulse to run away or we feel that impulse to control, we have to remind ourselves, okay, I'm in my fear right now. I'm in a wound right now. I'm creating story right now. Can I take a deep breath? Can I take a moment? And can I have a conversation with someone where I'm not just trying to convey what I am feeling, but I'm trying to really understand what they are feeling? And it begins with you. It begins with how you feel about yourself. So now I want to read a question that was submitted to me because I think it'll be very useful. This is something that I do often in my subscriber episodes of Jillian On Love. I try to take as many subscriber questions as possible and within just a 25-minute episode where I just answer a question as deeply. Sometimes it's 2 questions, sometimes it's 3 questions, sometimes it's 1 question as deeply as I possibly can. So this is a question that I think will be very, very useful for you. Hi, Jillian. Follow-up question to your podcast episode about cutting off the unhealthy relationship. You ended stating that you have to cut them off and let go. I cut mine off months ago and still can't let go emotionally, mentally, spiritually, etc. I'd love to hear about the next step to letting that go because it doesn't just end when you cut them off. No, of course it doesn't end when you cut them off. You know, the first step of ending a relationship, and this question is about ending relationships that are unhealthy or just very wrong for you. The kind of relationship that if you were to be honest with yourself and you were to think, okay, if I wake up a year from now, if I wake up 2 years from now or 10 years from now and I'm still with this person, I'm going to be really upset with myself and feel like I'm wasting my life. That kind of relationship. The first step is to untether yourself physically. So that's to stop spending time with them. That's to stop sleeping with them. That's to stop talking to them. You know, unless you share children. So that's the first step. And that sometimes is the hardest step for people to make. That is the first step. And then what comes after that is the work of healing. And the work of healing is slowly learning how to let go, to untether yourself mentally, emotionally, psychologically, all of that, spiritually. And that is a process that doesn't happen overnight. But some of the things that help are, for example, you have to stop following them on social media. And I know that that's really difficult. I know that we live in an age where that is extremely difficult, but you have to do that because let's just say you look at a story of theirs. And so every time you look at a story of theirs, you create your own story about their life and the situation that I promise you is a much bigger departure from reality than you think. And then the more that you create that story, the more then you are caught up in that story, and it blocks you from healing. You have to focus on yourself. You have to focus on understanding why you were in this relationship to begin with, and then taking the steps to move forward. Maybe this means healing certain things within yourself that you don't feel good enough. Maybe this is understanding the patterns that you have in a relationship that are not serving you. So bravo for ending the relationship. But now you have to really work hard to watch the chatter in your mind that tells you that maybe they're amazing. So maybe you're romanticizing them. Maybe you're romanticizing the relationship. Maybe you are coming to some sort of conclusions that you're not lovable or that you're never going to have the relationship that you want. So our mind can really become a battlefield and can really convince us of things that make healing so much more difficult. Nonetheless, if you've spent a lot of time with this person, it doesn't just stop internally. So you just have to focus on understanding why you were in it to begin with. I think it's time now to focus on certain things that make your life feel more meaningful. Typically, when we're in a relationship that's unhealthy, it takes a tremendous amount of energy from us. It takes a lot of mental real estate. And what I see that's very common that happens in these scenarios is that then we just ignore other parts of our lives. And so now you have the space to focus more on certain friendships, on community, on giving back, on becoming the person that you really want to become, on achieving and doing the things and experiencing the things that you really want to experience in life. And every day you do that a little bit more. And you do the things that are really going to help you feel more whole and more complete. Because often when things are really unhealthy, we think this person is going to fill a void. And whatever voids that you're feeling, whatever fears that you have about not being good enough, you have to now address that and become your own advocate and become your own best friend and become your own partner at this time. And you got to lean on friends. You got to lean on loved ones. You have to give yourself permission to have some joy. You have to keep reminding yourself that it takes time, and that even if you're feeling very, if you can't stop thinking about this person or you're still feeling tethered to them, that's normal, that letting go is a process. It's a process of unlearning all the things that we thought we had to be in order to be there in that relationship. It's a process of shedding skin. But in order to do that, we have to kind of become more of who we are, we have to become who we want to be. For everyone who's going through a breakup, especially a breakup from something unhealthy, there's huge growth opportunities before you. So you just have to see what it is that you need to do, where you want to put your energy. Because when we put a lot of energy into these unhealthy relationships, we waste a lot of energy. And so now it's about, okay, now I'm getting my energy back. Where do I want to put this? And then you'll start to see that the letting go is starting to happen. But you have to really keep reminding yourself of why you're not with this person. While a simultaneous path is understanding your pattern and what led you to this to begin with, so that you can learn, so that you can grow, and so that you can ensure that you don't repeat this pattern. And yeah, I wish there was a pill that you could take, or scissors that you can cut a piece of paper and then it's you're untied, or a ritual that you can do. It doesn't work like that. But bravo for taking the first step for untethering yourself physically, because that is the first step. The other steps cannot follow without this first step. And you just have to be patient and give it some time and be proactive about your healing. So I hope this helps.